Well, hello everyone. My name is Nam, and today I'll be addressing a controversial question. Is the gender wage gap a form of sexism, or could it be explained by other factors? My thesis is that the gender wage gap is not inherently the result of sex discrimination, but rather arises largely from differences in choices, roles, and other non discriminatory factors. We'll explore this position through philosophical frameworks, utilitarianism, contractualism, and of course, backed by empirical data and case studies. So let's get started. So, clarifying the wage gap. So, what does the statistic really mean? A lot of people have been spewing the fact that okay, woman makes 82 cents for every dollar men earn, and a lot more also say that 70 cents on the dollar. Well, this generally refers to the median earnings of all working men versus women. Well, importantly, this is not a comparison of men and women doing the same work with the same background. It's a broad statistic that doesn't control for occupation, hours, education, or experience. So, in other words, it captures aggregate differences, not a like for like pay discrimination metrics. So, what does this mean? I want to mention the term equal pay for equal work. So, unequal pay for equal work is illegal, right? And has been illegal for decades in many countries. Studies show that when you adjust for factors like hours worked, job title, education, and experience, much of the gap shrinks. So, for instance, women typically work fewer hours per week on average than men. Comparing hourly earnings rather than weekly earnings narrows the gap by one third, while controlling for education, experience, and occupation cuts it down even further. But according to the same research by the Fed in St. Louis, there's also an unexplained portion. So after accounting for major factors, there's a small residual gap remains. Like there was an analysis in the 1990s that found about a 6 cent on the dollar difference unexplained, which we could set here as the upper bound on what could be attributed to sexism, to discrimination. So even this slice can include difficult to measure factors like some women scaling back after motherhood, which we will discuss later. But tellingly, women in their 20s and early 30s with no children earn roughly about 98% of men's wage in the same age bracket. Virtually, like the gap is closed. So the key implication here is that the bulk of the wage gap is explained by choices and circumstances, not employers paying women less simply because they are women. So let's take a utilitarian perspective. Now, Mills famously said, "The only freedom, which deserves the name, is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we don't attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it." So let's analyze this issue. When we apply this to the wage gap, much of the gap arises because many women, especially mothers, chose more flexible work arrangements or shorter hours. They choose to prioritize family or work-life balance, which can indeed increase overall happiness of their own and or possibly, probably of their families. Men, on the other hand, often work longer hours, take on hazardous or highly competitive jobs to earn more. From a utilitarian view, these preference-based choices can lead to a net gain in well-being. Right? Each individual is optimizing what is valuable to them, and the utilitarian would ask, so would forcing a strictly equal pay outcome make anyone or make everyone happier? If the gap is mostly due to personal choices, then trying to eliminate it by mandate could involve limiting choice or imposing costly policies that might reduce overall welfare. For instance, you could say requiring every employee to ensure no gender earnings gap might mean constraining flexible schedules or penalizing those who take career breaks, potentially making workers and a lot of families worse off. As long as everyone's basic right to respect it, utilitarianism focuses on outcomes. And if the outcome is that individuals freely pursue their happiness, leads to some income divergent, then in itself, this is not an immoral result. In short, free choice and happiness, not enforcing equality at our cost, is the priority, according to a utilitarian view. So, furthermore, we should also look at the contractual perspective, which, according to Rawls, is when we can imagine people, free and rational people, choosing principles of justice from behind a veil of ignorance. This means not knowing if they'll be male or female, what talents or family obligations they will have. So, how does this relate to the gender wage gap? Let's apply it. First, fair equality of opportunity is the utmost importance. In a just society, anyone, regardless of gender, should have the same opportunity to pursue any careers or positions. Over the past decades, huge strides have been made over towards this idea: women's education, attainment, a lot of other things. If women have the same legal and practice opportunity to become doctors, CEOs, or engineers as men do, then any ensuing wage difference are not because the doors were closed to them. They are the result of their choice of factors, not because of a rich system. The question is, if people Would people behind the veil of ignorance accept these kinds of inequalities we see in the gender gap? So imagine that you don't know if you'll be born male or female. You want a society where your opportunities are open and fair. You might notice that in such a society there could still be an earnings gap, not due to one gender being oppressed, but because, for example, one group might tend, on average, to prioritize certain non-monetary goods more than the other. If those preferences are freely exercised, the resulting income inequality could be viewed as acceptable to some behind the veil, so long as it isn't caused by unfair discrimination. So crucially, no one behind the veil would agree to a principle mandating sexism or arbitrary bias that would violate equality of opportunity. But a gap arises from voluntary role divisions within families or personal career choice would be a different matter. So thus, from this contractualism lens, the gender wage gap isn't per se an automatically a case of injustice. Injustice would be in denial of opportunity or rights. For example, if women were barred from certain high-paying roles and paid less for the same work. But in a society where positions are open to all and the remaining pay gap comes from different choices, one could argue that rational people might accept that outcome as fair. So in short, inequality is not inequity, as it arises from a fair system of choices and mutually beneficial arrangements. Equal opportunity, not equal outcome. This phrase would come back again. And of course, now I want to go more into some more evidences and choices that could explain this gap. Let's talk about parenthood. Let's talk about the case of Denmark, a country that is well known for being very fair, being very progressive, especially in these matters. So in Denmark, researchers found that having children account for about 80% of the gender wage gap. This motherhood penalty is seen in many countries, and women without children have earnings very close to men, but mothers see a significant divergence in pay. So what this tells us is quite crucial. So even in a society with generous parental leave, Denmark, and subsidized childcare, women often choose to scale back or slow down in their careers after kids arrive, whereas men typically do not. The result is a long-term earnings gap, not because their employers are sexist, but because many mothers prioritize flexibility or family time, at least for some years. Correspondingly, some fathers may work more. There's even a term, fatherhood premium, where there's even a term fatherhood wage premium for men who earn more after becoming dads because they have to work longer to take care of their family. And then, of course, like the gap also widens in the 30s and 40s when caregiving peaks, and among young childless workers, like again, women earn roughly the same amount as men, 97 to 99% of the wages for men. So let's consider some major objections to our position. Critics might say that even if women choose lower paid paths, aren't those choices heavily influenced by sexism? Or don't gender norms and discrimination funnel women to certain roles or penalize them for motherhood? In other words, one could argue that our choices are not made in a vacuum. They're shaped by social pressures and expectations that are indeed sexist. Oh, additionally, there is evidence subtle discrimination. For example, studies have found women sometimes get passed over for promotions or face bias in male-dominated fields, which could contribute to the gap. But this is a very important point. But it's true that historical gender roles and biases have influenced how work and family responsibilities are divided. Even today, there may be an exception that the mother will be the one to step back. Expectation that the mother will be the one to step back when she's born. Stereotypes can also affect career choices early on. However, acknowledging these influences, which I do, is not the same as saying the wage gap is, as measured, is directly caused by sexist intent or a sexist system. Our question about the nature of the gap itself. The data from very reliable context telling, even when external sexism is minimized, a gap persists. A gap persists due to family dynamics. Recall Denmark, when I mentioned earlier. Despite strong gender equity policies, women earnings still drop after childbirth. This suggests that even in the absence of punitive workplace discrimination, many women and men make divergent choices around parenthood. So, in closing, we've argued that the gender wage gap is not inherently the result of sexism, but rather an outcome of complex factors, especially the different choices and roles that individuals freely assume. The gender wage gap over the years has narrowed significantly and will likely continue to do so as societal roles evolve. But even in an ideally free and equal society, we might not see a perfect 50-50 earning parity at all times. And that would not necessarily be a tragedy or an injustice. It could simply reflect the aggregated preferences, talents, and values of individuals. Our priority should be that we are ensuring that any woman who wants to pursue a high-paying career has no artificial obstacles in her way. And likewise, any man who wants to prioritize family should not be stigmatized. So to declare the wage gap proof of sexism is to oversimplify a nuanced reality. What we should do is let's instead celebrate the fact that men and women today have more freedom than ever to design their lives. Thank you. Thank you for listening.